Welcome back to A Celtic State of Mind. I'm Paul John Dykes, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Paddy Sinnott from Vital Celtic. You're joining us on the big charity weekender. Paddy, how are you, sir?
I'm good, mate. How are you doing?
I'm very well. It's always a pleasure to speak to fellow Celtic fans, but also those who have built up their own platform, be that a blog or a podcast, a broadcast. Tell us a wee bit about Vital Celtic. What is it that you do, Paddy?
Well, basically, I started the Vital Celtic blog. Oh God, it's about 2 years ago now. I'd actually opened up my own blog on my own Facebook page, and it must have got noticed because I got approached by Snack Media to start writing for their site after a couple of weeks. So I started writing for Vital Celtic, just reporting on anything that I thought that maybe the Celtic fans would be interested in, and it varies from, I don't know, transfer news, the usual kind of thing, pre-match, post-match, and I also try and find different kind of news that fans probably wouldn't have access to, or maybe not have the time to access. I've also covered your show a few times on my blog, as you know, because I think a lot of the stuff you guys talk about is relevant to what Celtic fans can relate to as well. And within, I don't know, about 2 years, about 18 months or so, I'd quit my job and started to do it full time. It grew, the site just grew in popularity, and yeah, it seems to be going all right. So, touch wood, it continues.
Fair play, Paddy. I think I always look back on the way that Celtic fans have embraced various different types of media, and I always go back to the old fanzine days. Jim Moore and I have a fascination with old fanzines, and I got into them very early on, probably before I could even understand what was going on in the kind of late 80s. I think it was about 88 actually that I started getting into Not the View, and I'm reading about things that at that age I should be reading about Paul McStay and how amazing he is as a footballer, but I'm reading all this boardroom stuff, you know.
Yeah.
And Celtic have got this knack, the fan base have got a knack of being ahead of the curve, because the people who were writing for Not the View were telling us about the fact that the club had to go public, the club needed a new stadium, the board weren't fit for purpose. And this is 87, 88. Took many years for that all to come to fruition, but there was a group of fans there who were talking about it all that time ago, and I was pretty politicised, I think, from a young age, because my old man was a striking miner, and so you know, not through choice, you understood politics and what happened if certain decisions were made at a high level. How did it affect the working classes? So when I'm reading this, I'm thinking, all right, I love the football, but I'm also interested in the politics of this football club, in terms of the board and sack the board and that movement that came through. And then fast forward to 2022, and I think Celtic have a very, very healthy amount of alternative platforms, be that blogs, podcasts, broadcasts. I think we're really spoilt for choice, and the fact that you're part of that is fantastic, and you're able to commit your day-to-day life around Celtic is something of a thrill, I'm sure.
No, I love it, and I mean, the Celtic fan base is so diverse, isn't it, with the different opinions I've got in the club. And I remember the days back in '88. I mean, I would have been 11, 12 years old. So, and I do remember frequenting the Jungle at that time when it was the old stadium at the Jungle, and that my first trip to Celtic Park got me hooked. I went. It was the Rangers end. It was an Aberdeen game, and it was a 0-0 draw. But it wasn't even the fact that it was a draw. The whole atmosphere around the stadium. I mean, I was a Celtic fan anyway. You're born into that. So yeah, but that was my first ever game, and then ever since then, I've been going to games and went to the Jungle with my brother, my friends. Absolutely loved it and had me hooked. But if you told me that I'd be doing it full time as a career, talking about my club, talking about how much I love my club, wow, I would have been. I'd have laughed at people.
It's phenomenal. Every time someone tells me about the Jungle, I think back to a game. It was a New Year's game. We got beat 3-1, and Celtic's goal was scored by Tony Mowbray. You remember it? It was absolutely hosing it down with rain. Mowbray scored the equaliser. There was a dodgy penalty. Gordon Marshall apparently brought down Alan McCoist, I think it was, and Mark Haitley scored the penalty, or the other way about. Kuznetsov scored, John Brown scored, they beat us 3-1. And I remember it was a horrendous day. and my old fella used to like take me into the jungle. And what I remember, Paddy, is he took me in, and because of the body heat, you felt a warmth, which actually physically you felt the warmth. But I think within the Celtic fan base, you do feel a warmth. You feel a warmth wherever you go and you meet somebody with the hoops and you can talk about Celtic. And I think it's great to celebrate the past and also look at the present. And that's what you and I are going to be doing today. And the very subject we're going to be talking about is the fact that Celtic, at this moment in time, have got some loan players both out the club and in the club. And what are we going to do with them? What do you think Ange is going to do with it, guys? But before we look at the present day, we're going to have a look in the past. We're going to go back to Martin O'Neill's final season, and we're going to have a look at some of the loan players and the ones that got away. Martin O'Neill is a hero of mine. I mean, Celtic, in terms of the managers, the first manager that I remember seeing as a fan going to the games was Billy McNeill. So I've seen us, that was his second spell through Liam Brady, Lou Macari, Tommy Burns and everybody since then. But Martin O'Neill in that period, in that era, is special because in all the years that I'd supported Celtic up to that point, I never believed we could ever do anything in Europe. I mean, we watched the double winners in Big Billy's season, the centenary year. Great side, fantastic side. But when we got knocked out the next season, you kind of expected to get knocked out of Europe in round one or round two. That's the kind of club Celtic were at that point. But when O'Neill comes in, you start believing, actually, we could do something in Europe. And I don't know if it's because of O'Neill's European credentials as a player, you know, being part of a Nottingham Forest team that won 2 European Cups back-to-back, or indeed, you just could see it in the flesh. The team that he was building was that good. I mean, he was plucking players from the English Premiership on English Premiership money. It's got to be said. But his final season, when I look back to the transfers that year, there's one that sticks out for me. We actually brought in 2 loan players, Paddy. The first one was Henri Camara, if you remember him.
Oh, aye.
He comes in from Wolves, but we brought in Craig Bellamy as well, and he came in on loan from Newcastle. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to have a look at some of the loan players that we've had in the past, and your memories of them, of those 2 players. This might sound as though it's a bit obvious. Any regrets? Any that you think might have got away?
Well, aye. I mean, Craig Bellamy was just, he was frightening. The guy had pace like I've never seen in my life. I mean, I think at his time at Celtic, he'd scored something like, I don't know, 8 goals, I think, in 12 appearances at the club, if I remember right. And I think he was one that, he was definitely one that I think that we should have pulled all the stops out to try and capture. He liked a good wind-up in the park. He liked to give it to the opposition. But he had an eye for goal, and he was electric. He
was a player that I think there was a real edge to him, Paddy, right?
Yeah.
You've talked about winding folk up. If you ever speak to anyone who played alongside him, everybody's got a tale about Craig Bellamy. You know, John Hartson always says that, you know, he wasn't the brightest in the dressing room and all this, and they wind each other up. But obviously he's had falling outs with the likes of Alan Shearer when he was at Newcastle. But I always remember reading Gordon Strachan's book, and he spoke about what he was faced with when he came into Celtic. He was faced with a situation where Martin O'Neill had built this fantastic team. There was a belief, I think, amongst the fan base that we could do something in Europe. And then it was coming to the end of its cycle in many ways, you know. We'd lost Henrik Larsson, and we were in a situation where we had guys like Chris Sutton, Neil Lennon, Alan Thompson and John Hartson, who were all on big wages, but they probably weren't at an age where we could sell them for any kind of value. Great players as they were. So Strachan had a really, really difficult time, I think, when he came in at Celtic. But he had a dilemma, and he wrote about it in his book. And what he said was that there was a transfer budget there. He could have signed Craig Bellamy, and it would have cost the club £5 million. And his idea, Strachan obviously had managed Coventry previously, and John Hartson was there, Craig Bellamy was there.
That's right. Yeah.
And he thought, I could marry these 2 guys up. But he's looking across the budget, and he's thinking, I need more than one player. Mm-hmm. And he's decided to go, and eventually he purchased Nakamura, Zuraski and Boric. So as much as I love Bellamy, and I would have loved to have seen him being a permanent player at Celtic and play a full season, do you think Strachan might have made the right decision in the end?
Well, when you look at these three players you just mentioned there, Artur Boric is an absolute legend, isn't he? I mean, he's one of the players that you take to your heart, and he stays there. He just had a knack for having that relationship with the Celtic fans. And then when you look at Nakamura, I mean, what that guy could do with a ball was unreal. And I'll always remember that free kick that won us the league. Was it against Kilmarnock, I think?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And the scenes after that, Strachan jumping up, running down the touchline, was that for me is iconic at that time. But when you look at what Strachan was faced with, like you said at the start, he had to downsize. I mean, he had to downsize the wage bill, and also obviously still compete in the league. And when you look at what he did, getting these players off the wage bill and still building a good team, we can still say that Bellamy was one that got away. But look at what we got instead. Magic Zarowski, he was one of the players who again had an eye for a goal. I can't really mind off the top of my head what his strike rate was, but he was a decent player. But if you look at Boric and Nakamura, the two players that we got instead of Bellamy, I think when you put it that way, he's probably no one to get away. When you think about it, I think he's probably one that's done well. I suppose you could look at it the same way as when, for us to get Chris Sutton, we had to sell Mark Viduka. I think you mentioned that in your show this afternoon. So I suppose there's pros and cons. But when you look at what Gordon Strachan did during his time at Celtic, his record itself was phenomenal as well. Champions League last 16, still winning the league. I think it was three league titles he won.
3 in a row, yeah.
3 in a row. So, I suppose it's a double-edged sword, really. Paul John, when you think about it, yeah, he is one to get away, but we managed to build a side with three players down the middle of the park, with Boric, Nakamura and Zarowski up top.
You know, that's the thing. We love a flair player. I think, historically Celtic have always loved that entertainer. And you think of Bellamy and the spark, he was electric, and you think, I'd love to have signed him. But then you look at what Strachan actually did. And there's a great debate to be had, I think, when you look at, you compare and contrast what Strachan did against what O'Neill did with different budgets. It's a tremendous debate to have. I mean, I much preferred watching Matt O'Neill's team. There is no doubt whatsoever about that. But it would be a good debate. Maybe we'll have that on a Celtic State of Mind at some point. The other player I mentioned there, Henri Camara, he had a very interesting career. He went on to make 99 appearances for Senegal, scoring 29 goals, and he had a whole host of clubs after Celtic. And I seem to remember him playing in one of these rest of the world games live on TV at some stage, and I remember watching him thinking, wow, he's been selected for the rest of the world, because I didn't think he was that great when he played for Celtic. But again, these are the things. One other memory that I've got, you mentioned the Kilmarnock game with Nakamura scoring the free kick, the celebration of him ripping the jersey off and swinging it around the top of his head. And you love that, and that is iconic. And I love that jersey and everything else. Everything about that goal was superb. But what I do remember about that as well is I eventually spoke to Saul Davis, who's a guitar player in the band James, who I love. I love all that kind of music from that era. And it just so happens that Tim Booth from James got very friendly with Gordon Strachan when Strachan played for Leeds. Tim Booth's a big Leeds fan, lead singer of James. They became pals. So every time James are touring about, Strachan will drop him a wee message or phone him, and James will make sure that obviously he gets all the treatment. Paddy, Gordon Strachan gets all the VIP seats and all the rest of it. So I think James were playing maybe a festival or a gig. It may have been a festival at that point of the season, near the end of the season. And so they drop a wee message to Strachan, and instead of them getting the VIP hospitality treatment, they're in the back of the goals. They're in behind that free kick, in the cheap seats, as it were. But Saul Davis and Tim Booth and all the rest of it enjoyed their time there. If we fast forward into Strachan's first season, this is quite an interesting one, in that we sign a player called Du Wei. And I don't have to ask you if you think he was one that got away Du Wei, because obviously his signing's been pretty notorious. because you only played one game, and we know what game that is, Paddy, against Clyde in the Cup.
That's right.
Would have absolutely knocked us out. And by the way, when they scored their opening goal, they'd already had 2 goals chopped off at that stage. And you think, right, that was a pretty drastic result, but it could have even been worse because
it was Roy Keane's debut as well, wasn't it?
Roy Keane's debut, and
I'm sure,
aye. And the thing with that is, you remember all these wee things like the strip we wore, right? Now that could have been the best Celtic strip of all time, but because it was worn in that game. I think about it and I'm like, even when I was compiling my latest book all about the Celtic jerseys, and I was looking at, I was looking at that jersey and I'm thinking, I can't look at it the same way. It's been soiled in many, many ways because of that result. And the loan market is something that we have used and utilised, and we utilised it initially with Boruc, came in on loan and we made it permanent. And something I often forget is we've done the same with Samaras, Paddy.
That's
so
right.
he came in initially on loan. And I don't obviously have to talk about him getting away because we made it permanent. But what is your thoughts on Samaras? Because I know he divided opinion among Celtic fans. Which side of the fence were you on?
Oh, I was in one of the. I was in the frustrated fan side. I think I felt. I mean, the guys. I felt he could have done more when he was on the park. I felt he was kind of lazy when he played. I remember when he got his contract, he got a contract extension off the back of the 2 goals at Ibrox when we won 2-0. That's when he got his contract extension. I was thinking, we're seriously giving this guy a contract extension based on that. And the flip side of that, my family loved him. They thought he was great. I mean, it's weird though, because I was part of George's Samaras CSC. My cousin made it up, and I still swear he done it just to wind me up because he knew how I felt about him. But we were part of that at a CSC. It was registered and everything as well, but definitely one that frustrated me. I just think the way he kind of walked about the park, it just seemed as if he wasn't interested. But when he got a sniff at goal, I mean, he would stick at the back of the pokey. But I was on that side of the fence where I felt he could have done more for the side.
When I think about Samaras, the divide was, I had one opinion, my brother and my dad had another. And I remember them changing slightly after the game that you're talking about, the 2-0 game at Ibrox. But then I remember being in the Broom loan with a few pals of mine at that time where we got the penalty. And I'm not saying it fell out. We have seen players falling out over penalties in the past with Celtic, but there was certainly a discussion between Chris Commons and Samaras, you'll remember. Yeah. And Samaras wins the debate, takes the penalty, and it's missed. And when you look back on that game at the end of the season, if we win that game 1-0, we win the league. We win the league because I think, that would have been the difference. We would have won the league. So as much as I love him, there's that wee bit that kind of gets stuck in the back of my throat from time to time.
Doesn't it?
It does. Yeah. And I was in the back of a taxi in Heraklion, which is the place of his birth and Giacomakis' birth. And of course, Paddy, you speak to the taxi driver about George's Samaras. It's the only subject you've got to talk to him about.
Yeah.
And he had the same view. He was like, he turns up for the big games for the Greek national team, but, he's lazy in other games, he hides in other games. And I think he saw that at Celtic. Against Barcelona, you think to yourself, right, you can count on Samaras. Against Ross County away, probably not.
No, exactly.
He was that type of player. But over the piece, I did love him. We're going to fast forward a wee bit here because we're now in the era of Tony Mowbray. And I don't know what you thought when Mowbray took over at Celtic, because I loved him as a player. I know he was limited. I spoke about that Rangers game earlier where he scores a header. I saw most of his games when he signed for Celtic. I know he was limited, but he was a bit of a leader. He was a character. He had a bit of personal tragedy. And of course, he introduced the huddle when he was at Celtic.
That's right.
So when he comes in as a manager, I'm thinking back probably to his Hibs team rather than his West Bromwich Albion team. And I'm, at the time, pretty positive about it. I mean, what was your view on that, Paddy?
That was one of the moves that I thought was a decent move because his brand of football suited us. He had a good style of attacking football. It's funny, I was writing about Tony Mowbray, it must have been about 2 weeks ago, and I'm sure I read somewhere that his brand of football was probably ahead of his time, and that's probably why it did me work. I've need to dig out that quote, but I'm sure I read something about that. But I thought it was a good appointment at the time. I liked his style of football. I liked the way he approached the game, and for whatever reason, it just didn't seem to work for him at Celtic. But I suppose it's one of the ones where you need to have a mindset to manage and play for Celtic, don't you? You could have all the skill in the world, you could have all the talent in the world, but you've got to have a kind of mental state to be able to play for a club like ours, because the pressure on the player and the manager to win every week, and not just win, but win well, is immense. And maybe that's something that maybe Mowbray struggled with. I don't know, but I just think that for the way it worked out for Mowbray, it was a shame, because it showed promise. I personally felt at that time it showed promise, but it just wasn't to be. And I think St Mirren, was it 4-0 St Mirren?
Yes.
It sealed his fate, wasn't it? So, well, it wasn't just that, to be fair. There was other things. But that was the breaking point.
It definitely was. I mean, when you look at his career post-Celtic, he's managed Middlesbrough, Coventry, Blackburn Rovers and Sunderland. He's still in the game. Some big clubs in amongst those, but I think the Celtic job, did it come too soon for his management
That's what
career?
I think. Aye.
Possibly.
I think so.
And I liked the fact that Peter Grant was there. I loved Granty as a player.
He was one of my favourites growing up. I loved Peter.
I love Peter Grant. Yep. But it seemed as though he wasn't as vocal or as involved. Now, we're only seeing what's happening on the sidelines. We don't know what happens behind the scenes. But I was very disappointed in how it turned out for Tony Mowbray. But I'm going to look at some of his signings that he made. He wasn't at the club for a great length of time, and he was utilising at this stage a couple of different methods. The first method was the loan market, and the other one was, at that time, I remember Celtic were signing a lot of younger players, like project players, Paddy, who they were hoping to mould into first teamers. So we were signing a lot of players that never came through, never made the grade. And one of them actually was Paul Slane at Motherwell, who went on to fame and fortune within Scottish football, but not on the pitch. Yeah. So let's talk about the loanees, because that's what we're going to chat about. And we signed a midfield player called Landry Nguemo from AS Nancy. And again, like what you've just said, I thought it started off really, really well for him. He put me in mind a wee bit. For me, anyway, he was a guy who broke up play really, really well, and he linked the defence with the attack. But alas, I think we look back on him not too fondly. Was he one that got away, or do you think that he was just really a product of the times?
Aye, I think so. I think he was one that just maybe was caught up in that era, wasn't he? And it was, I suppose it was, he came with a lot of promise, if I remember right. I feel like a national as well. But I think he's one of the players, and we'll probably touch on this a bit later as well when we talk about or if we do talk about a player like, I don't know, like Diego Laxalt, who came in at a time when probably didn't allow him to flourish. And I think working under Tony Mowbray, and at that time maybe stunted his Celtic career. Landry Nguemo, I mean, the name is always kind of floated about the circles, but and I think it's telling that I can hardly remember him when he played for Celtic, and I think that in itself is probably a bigger story, not a story, but a bigger telltale sign than anything else, because I remember when he signed, and I remember he came not so much with a fanfare, but he was a decent player. But other than that, like you said there, he didn't really do much for the rest of the season. And I suppose when you're looking at Tony Mowbray's record, there's a reason for that.
Yeah, definitely. I remember the marquee signing was Marc-Antoine Fortuny.
Fortuny, aye.
Who also came in from Nancy as well, just under £4 million. And, he was one of those non-scoring strikers, Paddy, which it's never going to work at Celtic, I don't think. No. There were a few other loanees. I'm going to throw in another couple of names before we get to the one who might have got away. Diamanski Camara, another Camara, and Edson Braithwaite, one of only two players who have played for Celtic and also played at a World Cup final or in a final. Yeah, but I don't look back on Edson Braithwaite's Celtic career with much pleasure, I've got to say, or Camara's for that matter.
No, I mean, Edson Braithwaite was another one that came with a big reputation for Bayern Munich, didn't he? And he was I remember writing about him as well when I was kind of looking into Braithwaite. I listened to Mark Wilson, and Mark Wilson said that his attitude was stinking at Celtic. That
Right.
he said that all he did when he turned up for training was try to nutmeg folk, and then he would wonder when the nutmegs didn't come off why he was never getting selected at the weekend. And I think he only made something like 12 appearances that season when he came in for Celtic, and that explains why. So I think for him, it was probably more an attitude problem than anything else, coming from Bayern Munich, thinking he was bigger and better than what we had. So that's that's something that I'd found out. And yep. What was the other player you said there again? Fortuna?
Diamanski Kamara.
Kamara. Yeah. It was. Where did he come from? West Brom, was it? Was it West Brom he was signed from?
Well, we signed him from Fulham, although he had played for West Brom, Paddy.
That's right, aye. Again, another player that tells you the story I don't really remember much about, so definitely no one to get away, and you could definitely say that about Braithwaite, and simply just because his attitude wasn't quite right to play for a club like Celtic, I think.
No, you're right. The one thing when I looked at Kamara's name there is my memory of him was he played against St Johnstone in Europe up at Perth. He was in Turkey playing his football at that point. And I remember that game more than much that he did for Celtic. But the final one, I think there is an argument, a debate, a discussion around whether or not he was one that got away. He came in something of a fanfare. It was Robbie Keane. Came in from Spurs.
Yeah.
I was delighted, Paddy, when he signed for Celtic.
100%.
And, it was one of the ones as well that almost to finance the deal, we sold Scott McDonald to Middlesbrough, didn't we, for about $3.5 million. So I was a wee bit disappointed that we didn't keep Robbie Keane, but I just think that it was really a case of there was still a career for him in the English Premiership at that stage.
Aye. I think his goal scoring record when he came up here was excellent. He scored 16 goals in 19 appearances, but he didn't manage to win a trophy, which was a shame because his form deserved it, and he was a player. He was, even when he played for Spurs, when he came to us, I couldn't believe we signed him, to be honest, because he was would you call him a superstar in the Premier League? I suppose you would, wouldn't you? Would he be called a superstar? I don't know. But he was a cracking player. I loved him and all, quick as well. 100% he's one that got away. But when he was with us, he did a brilliant job for us. It's just a pity we couldn't return that with a medal of some sort for him.
Oh, definitely. And I always find it interesting that I had followed his career, both with Ireland and his club career, because I found him a very exciting player. Yeah. Signed for big money to Coventry. I remember him going to Inter Milan, and obviously big moves that followed that as well. The ex-Celt that gave him his senior debut whilst he was at Wolverhampton Wanderers was none other than Mark McGee. Mark McGee gave Robbie Keane his senior debut, and I love little facts like that because obviously Mark McGee over the piece had been touted from time to time as being someone that might end up as a manager of Celtic, but it's interesting how career trajectories go because I obviously wouldn't want that to happen now. The
particular reason?
Oh dear, there's been a few. The next player, and again under Neil Lennon. Neil Lennon comes in after Tony Mowbray, and at that time, I remember at the end of the season he'd done okay. But obviously there was that blot in his copybook, which was the Ross County defeat in the semi-final with the Scottish.
That's right. Yeah.
And when he comes in, when you start looking at some of the transfers, there were certainly hits and there were misses in that first season, bringing in guys like Efrain Juarez for 2 or 3 million quid.
That was a $3.5 million. I'm sure that one was. It was ridiculous money.
Terrible. But the thing is with Juarez, I do remember very quickly there was interest. There was interest from down south, but then the wheels just came off for Juarez. Daryl Murphy came in from Sunderland for just under $1 million.
Yeah.
But that's the kind of bad signings. There were some really, really shrewd signings as well. Chris Commons for $300,000 was an absolute snip.
Yeah,
that was a snip.
Steal. Yeah.
And we forget, like Emilio Izaguirre, I think his fee was under £1 million as well. Brilliant bit of business. Up until he broke his leg, and I'm not saying he was a bad player after he broke his leg, but up until that moment, the performances you've seen from Izagiri were absolutely astonishing.
The guy was phenomenal, wasn't he? He
was
just came
tremendous.
he just came in and, I mean, nobody heard him. And then when Lennon signed him, we were thinking, who is this guy, I suppose? And then, like yourself, until he broke his leg, his form was just something else. Nobody could get by him. He used to ghost past players up that flank. The guy was just phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal.
He really was. And then you had Kyle coming in for just over £1 million. I thought over the piece. Again, I was really frustrated with the injury that he sustained, and it was Lee McCulloch against Rangers. It was McCulloch that took him out. Gary Hooper was sensational for us. And, there's other players like Tony Watt, right? So we bring him in for something like 90 grand, I think it was, from Airdrie United. But we ended up selling him for like 1.2 million quid, Paddy,
Yeah.
And people think that he didn't fulfil his potential at Celtic, but Celtic done a decent turn on him in terms of profiting from him. But the one player we want to talk about is Fraser Forster. And I remember him coming in from Newcastle United and sitting there at Celtic Park, and at half-time, you'll remember it, Stevie Woods, he never ever went in for his half-time team talk. What happened was he stayed on the park, Stevie Woods would come on, and he would flight crosses in, he would flight balls in, and he was working even at half-time with Fraser Forster, who at that time didn't have a great deal of experience. And I wasn't convinced with him until a moment where he saved a penalty against Hearts. You remember that?
Yeah.
Up to that point, I could have taken or left Fraser Forster, and I know that he came back for quite a few loan deals over the piece. What was your first impressions of the big man?
Oh, first, I suppose the same as you. Never really knew much about him. I think he signed for Newcastle on loan. If I remember right, I don't even think he could get on the bench there. So you're thinking, well, who's Fraser Forster? But I mean, when you look at what he's done for Celtic, I think he had 3 loan spells, or 3 spells, 2 loan spells and a permanent spell at Celtic. The guy was one of the best shot stoppers I think I've seen since Artur Boric. I'm trying to think of the goalkeepers I've seen in my time. Certainly one of the best in my time. But first impressions, didn't know much about him, but he certainly showed us what he could do within that first season under Lenny.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously, what most folk will remember about Fraser Forster is that League Cup final against Rangers 2 seasons ago. It was just his performance that day was just something else.
It was incredible.
Honest to God, I couldn't believe the saves the guy was pulling off. But he was huge though, and you often wonder as a striker how you're going to get the ball past this guy, because he had a big frame, he was tall, but he was athletic. He was agile as well. I thought one of the best keepers I've seen at Celtic in my lifetime.
I'd need to agree with that. I mean, that cup final you're speaking about there, Paddy, a few things I remember vividly about that game. First being Forster's performance was incredible.
Outstanding.
He was superb. I remember El Yunusi. There was 2 starters that day who probably shouldn't have started, and it was El Yunusi and Lewis Morgan up top. And that was never going to work. But El Yunusi wasn't fit. I mean, he was going at about 40% speed.
Aye.
And I think he got hooked at half-time. So your game plan, you're up against it because your first 11 obviously hasn't worked. Frimpong was brilliant that day and he ends up getting sent off.
I know. Poor guy, he was heartbroken, wasn't he?
I know. And look what he's gone on to achieve as well. Quite sensational. And what is coming through here is when you're talking about Neil Lennon signings, I'll tell you what, he didn't half signed some amount of talent whilst he was at Celtic. Yeah, there was a few duds, we know that, but there was a lot of talented players that he brought in. Even Tony Stokes for 1.2 million. We got that back with goals from Tony Stokes over the piece. A couple of loanees. I know that Forster comes back in on loan from Newcastle, but another couple of loanees comes in the following season. Bajel Kaduri from Dynamo Kiev. I remember he made his debut against Rangers. I don't think he's one that got away.
I'll need to think about that one, I think.
And a striker called Paweł Brozek. Remember the Polish striker that came in?
That's right.
and these are two guys that are not even footnotes in the history of Celtic Football Club because they were simply just transfers that didn't work out. But again, we're using the loan market here, Paddy, and you're not really, you're not losing anything if it doesn't work out.
I mean, all you're losing is the salary, really, aren't you? What you're covering in wages. So I suppose when you look at it for that sense, well, no losing out in the two kind of guys. But like you say, Lennon's signings in his first tenure, I'm sure Lennon brought in Wanyama and Ledley as well, if I remember right. And look at what the two guys did for the club. I loved Joe Ledley. I think he's another player that kind of divides opinion amongst the fans, unless I've got the wrong end of the stick on that one. But I loved Ledley. I loved Wanyama. The guy was just a beast. He was just one of the players that I wouldn't fancy pairing up against him in the middle of the park. If I seen him, a bit like Bobo Baldi.
Yeah.
You just see a man mountain. You know you're going to get crunched if you get anywhere near him. But Lennon had decent success in the transfer market. But like you see, the transfer market is one of the ones where you can never predict who's going to be a good signing or who's not. It's like I said at the start of the show. It's not just about your ability. It's about your state of mind when you come to play for Celtic, or it's about if you've got the mental capacity to play for a club at Celtic, because the pressure on you is on you every week. And I think that's why when some players leave Celtic and go to maybe smaller clubs, we look back at them and go, look how well they're performing there. Did we miss out? I mean, John Guidetti is a perfect example of that. That guy, he came to Celtic, just couldn't quite cut the mustard, but look at what he's wanting to achieve in the clubs that he's played for. So I think for Lennon himself, for all we can talk about the poor signings, he'd certainly pulled a couple out of the bag. He also sold some players on for decent profit as well during this time.
He certainly did. And again, on the show, time and time again, especially in that final season, I and others were very critical of Neil Lennon. But when you start looking through the transfer business, and in particular in the first period, as you said, in his first tenure, it's very, very impressive. I mean, the following season, he brings in Foster, Efe Ambrose and Tam Rogic, and for a combined total of £4 million for those three players. The loan players that we brought on, however, were a mixed bag. Miku came in from Getafe, and he ended up playing in that famous game against Barcelona.
Yeah, that's right.
10 years ago. And, a couple of guys that I'm pretty sure most of us will have forgotten by now. Lubos, Kaminar and Victor Noring, two goalies, came in on loan, never played. But remember, Rami Gershon came in from Standard Liège. He was the Israeli internationalist, centre-half. And he came in, but he didn't want to sign permanently, ended up going elsewhere. So I think that was another Israeli player. Neil Lennon obviously worked quite closely with various agents, one of which was supplying a lot of players from Israel. We'd already signed Berem Kayal, and we were to sign other players afterwards as well. But yeah, in terms of the loan market, we were using the loan market slightly less than under Tony Mowbray at this stage. And I think that Neil Lennon started building a side that he was bringing players in with a view to selling them on. Guys like Van Dijk coming in for $2.5 million. Even, Stefan Johansson came in for $2 million. We make a profit on him, for example. But there's always a few that don't work out, and that's just football. I remember Neil Lennon talking about Borigta, one of the worst signings actually in his time. And he says that it's always quoted as being a £3 million signing, but he never actually cost £3 million. I think it was closer to 1.5. But he was a guy who was a complete waste of money. You mentioned the loan deal for John Guidetti.
Yeah.
Right. So far, I think, Paddy, we're both of the kind of view that Robbie Keane was one that got away.
Yeah.
Craig Bellamy.
It's half and half, really, with him.
It's half and half because of what Strachan did afterwards. What's your view on John Guidetti then? Because he comes in under Ronnie Dyler and he starts off like a house on fire.
He does. And then it just, I don't know what happened to him after that. It just didn't seem to work out for him. And then when you look at what he's done now, I think, where was it? Last season he was at Norwich. Was it Norwich? Or is he still at Norwich now?
That was Timo Pukki.
That's Timo Pukki.
That's Pukki, aye.
I've got that many players running through my head and written down here that I'm getting mixed up. But John Guidetti is definitely one that I think had potential to succeed at Celtic, but just for whatever reason didn't work out. But another one that I think we got on loan, I personally think got away, was Jason Denayer. Jason Denayer was one that had a brilliant partnership with Virgil in the centre of defence, and obviously in that first season he was here, they won a League Cup double, and you could just see that with him beside Virgil van Dijk, the two of them just strolled games, and they were so comfortable, easy on the ball, they could just nullify threats. Definitely he was one to get away from me, and when you look at what he's playing now, I think he's with some Saudi team, and he's only 27 years old, he's got 35 caps for Belgium as well, and he's wasting his time playing there. I find that unreal, unbelievable. But yeah, Jason Denayer was one as well that I thought was a brilliant signing for us, and he's definitely one for us that got away. But then at the end of the season, he said he had no intentions of signing on permanently for Celtic. His ambition was to play in the Premier League or to play in England somewhere, which is a shame, because I just think that he could have been someone like Virgil van Dijk, where he could have made that big move to England and then maybe possibly get a better move than they did. I know he went to Lyon, and I know Lyon's a big club, but look at where he is now. You kind of think he's wasting his career. I'm sure I can't remember the name of the team he's playing for now, but it's in Saudi Arabia anyway. So a complete waste of good talent there.
Yeah, I agree with that, because I think his name was pitched a few times on Acsom over the last few months, right, as a player that we should have made efforts to bring in as a centre half. It could well go back to that point you raised previously with Ange Postecoglou, where he buys the character as well as the actual ability. But of the loan deals that came in, we've mentioned Guidetti. Yeah, he could have done a lot better, but the fact that we didn't sign him didn't bother me by the end. Denayer, I would have loved him to stay. And the other players were Joe Ingeberget, Alexander Tonev, and Mubarak Wakaso. And I don't think anybody is going to cry into their pillows that any of those three didn't.
You've pulled out some crackers there, so you have.
I mean, I remember Wakaso scoring on the night of the independence vote. You remember that game? We're playing away from home. Celtic are wearing the away jersey with the kind of tartan design, which I don't think was a coincidence. We're wearing that tartan design that night, and he scored that night. I think it was a 2-2 draw in the Europa League away from home. It was one of those forgettable European campaigns under Ronnie Deila. But no, out of all those players, although there was undoubted talent, I think that Denayer is the guy that I wish had stayed at Celtic. There was a partnership there with Van Dijk, like you quite rightly said. And a few people have argued on the show as well, saying that it's similar to the situation with Carter Vickers. It's Carter Vickers plus another, and he's going to make them look good. And some people said that about Van Dijk and Denayer, but I actually think in his own right, Denayer was a right 100%. Decent player.
Yeah. The guy was a class act. There's no doubt about it. Even if Van Dijk wasn't there, it could have been Jason Denayer in another. He was that good. That's what I personally feel anyway. I just think you don't go on to have the kind of international career he's had by being the another to another defender, do you? He certainly could have held the line himself, regardless whether Van Dijk was there or not.
100%. Now, if we actually move into the era of Brendan Rodgers, the loan market was something that we were still utilising, and it's going to be interesting to check some of these guys out. So the following season, Patrick Roberts, remember him?
We talk about him every transfer window, don't we? And every transfer window there's a talk about him, bring him home, and all this kind of nonsense that surrounds Roberts. It turns into a bit of a circus, regardless how good he was.
Absolutely. And the other player who is definitely going to be forgotten about probably by the end of this particular show is Tyler Blackett. Tyler Blackett was a player who came in on loan from Man United. So I think the Patrick Roberts Manchester City move is one that has long been discussed. Whether or not it would have worked out permanently, who knows? But it's one that, in terms of did he get away, I look at what we've had since Paddy. I loved Paddy Roberts, by the way. I know that he was in on loan twice, but I look at, for example, what we've got right now, and I think, would he get into Angie's team? There you go, Paddy. There's a question for you. Would Paddy Roberts get into Angie's team?
No. Not at all. I don't think so. When you look at what we've got currently now, with Haksabanovic, Jota, even Maeda and Abada, not a chance. What player could you bring in that's going to dislodge those guys?
Precisely.
It's difficult to say. When we signed Haksabanovic, I thought, where's he going to play? But we'll see within his first appearance, within the first 10-15 minutes when he came on, you could see this guy was a player. And you just knew that I thought maybe it meant curtains for Maeda when we signed Haksabanovic, but Paddy Roberts, he I'm not going to say they couldn't lace their boots, but you know where I'm going with this one. There's no chance you could make it into that side at all. Not a chance.
And I found it interesting that it was disclosed that Ange had spoken to him over the phone, and it was Ange's decision. There was an opportunity to sign Paddy Roberts. Ange decided against it. It goes back to the point you made at the start of the show. There's been loads of other loanees. Shout out if you think I'm missing anything on any of these, because I don't think that we missed the boat on the likes of Charlie Musonda. No. Because he was a player that came in with a lot of promise on big wages. Didn't really do it for Celtic.
I was actually excited when we signed him because I'd heard a lot about him, and I thought he'd have been a player, probably kind of like a Patrick Roberts type player who would have that spark. But for whatever reason, again, he just didn't cut the mustard at Celtic. But at that point when he signed it, I thought he'd have been a good signing for us.
Yeah, and eventually the loan was cancelled before the end of it. We bring in players like Daniel Orzani, as well as Filip Benkovic, who I thought a lot of at the time, but his career has shown that he, in terms of injuries, he's up there with Josip Simunovic, is injury prone. Oliver Burke, the most expensive Scottish footballer in the history of the game, if you accumulate all these transfers. Timo Weah.
Timo Weah. Do you know, I had Timo Weah written down here as one of the loans in, and I had a question mark beside him. Mm-hmm. And I think the question mark is because I look at the kind of player he is now. I know he plays in France now, and I thought, looking at him, he played in the World Cup this year as well, but his scoring rate isn't that good. But he's just that, I don't know, I just took to him. I just took to him as a person. I took to him as a player. I like to look at him. Obviously, he's got that. He's quick as well. He was fast, but I had a question mark beside him. If we gave him a chance, an opportunity, would he have been one that could have made it to Celtic? I don't know.
Again, I think a lot of that goes back to his character, his personality.
Yeah,
he showed. So. Yeah, even recently talking about Celtic and Neil Lennon, and some suggestions that there was a clash there. He spoke highly of Neil Lennon and Celtic. So I think there's a professionalism there, and there's a humility that guys like you and I would warm to, because it's our football club that he's representing. Jeremy Toljan, one of those long list of right backs who, all the while we had Tony Ralston that probably would have done a better job. So I don't think much of him. I don't think he was the one that got away. And you've also got guys like Maurice Bauer. But here's one that I would argue would have done a job, and I think he would have done a job under Ange Postecoglou, and that's Mohamed El Younousi. And my kind of thinking behind that, I remember having a discussion with Alan Morrison about the type of player that Ange liked, and one of the types of players that he liked was an attacking player who had defensive qualities.
Yeah.
And I think El Younousi had that. He was inconsistent, Paddy, and he obviously played in that season where it was difficult to see any good or positive in the Celtic side in his second loan deal. But he's a guy that I would argue, I think he did get away. I think he would have done a job for Celtic.
He was a really good player, dead direct as well, wasn't he? And he liked to kind of take on defenders. And I think I agree with you. I think El Younousi is one that did get away. And like you say, he had an engine, and that's the sort of thing we need in an Ange team, don't we? We need somebody that can run all day and take on players and be that flair player, unlock defences. I agree with you. I think he's one that got away. Yeah.
Now I'm going to really quickly bring this up to date, because the names of Shane Duffy, Diego Lixalt, and John Joe Kenny are on my list here, Paddy, and I really don't. expect you or anybody else to start arguing with me when I say that they weren't the type of player that got away. In fact, you were glad when they left, obviously.
You don't think that was just a victim of circumstance over the 3 players?
Certainly, I was impressed with Laxalt.
Yeah.
Initially, and people might think that's strange looking back, but his performances initially I was really impressed with. John Joe Kenny, I never got my head around that. I just felt it was a real drop in standards from the fact that we had sold Frimpong, who I don't think defensively was the best right back we've ever had, but we sell Frimpong and we replace him with a guy that can't get a game for Everton.
Yeah.
Never worked out for him. And as I say, he's another right back, and we had Tony Ralston sitting there all the while. Shane Duffy, circumstances, I think, probably worked against him.
I think for him, more down to the fact that he had a lot of personal stuff going on as well. Shane Duffy's a good defender. He's a good defender. He just, at the time he joined us in the biggest season in our history, or recent history, I suppose you could argue. And in the middle of a COVID season where you couldn't mix with folk, he seems like a guy that needed that personal interaction, didn't he? He's a big, likeable guy. I think out of the 3 of them, I think he's probably the one that I would say, no, it didn't get away, but I think he's one that I think if he came at a different time, he would have been a success at Celtic.
Yeah, it's an interesting angle on it. Jota, Maeda and Carter Vickers obviously were loans that worked, and we managed to get all 3 of them in the door permanently. But it brings us up to this season, Paddy, and the big question, of course, is the guys that we've got in on loan at this moment in time. So I'm going to ask you the question. I don't think we've seen enough of Abligor yet. No. And the other player that we've got is Maurice Shentz, and now he's obviously been on all the Celtic blogs and in the news with these comments about Celtic, which I think we all loved.
Yeah.
But
he knows how to pull the heartstrings, doesn't he?
He does. We were talking about the way that Timo Weah went about his business. Yeah. And there is a way of getting in amongst the good books, as it were. But as we sit here right now, give me your take on whether or not we keep Jens and whether or not we keep Abligor.
I agree. Abelgard, I think it's difficult to say. I've not seen enough Abelgard. And I think what's telling with him is he didn't get a game when McGregor was out. I think that's really telling in the fact that we juggled Matt O'Reilly and shoehorned him into that position rather than go with either Abelgard or Ideguchi or McCarthy. I think is really telling. So I'm going to say, just based on that, I think he's one that's not going to stay beyond this season. I would keep Jens. But then you have an issue as if we keep Jens, then where does that leave Stephen Welsh? Does that leave him to go out on loan, or does he cut his ties? Because he's 23 years old. He should be at a stage where he's looking for regular first team football. But I like Big Jens. I think he's composed on the ball. He's a good passer. I think it was when I did a piece on Jens during the Champions League. He was one of the top passers in the Champions League. Now I know he can't really go much with passes, but it just shows you how composed the guy was. When he was playing for us in that back line. But I would definitely keep Jens. He can be prone to a wee mistake or two, but I think he developed a good partnership with Carter Vickers whilst Starfelt was out, and I think he's one that's worth kind of maybe taking a punt on. But I suppose it depends on how much we're looking to pay for him, because I know he's got an option to buy. As an option to buy. I don't think it's an obligation to buy. It's an option to buy at the end of the season. But what sort of money we're talking? I don't know. But I think if you're talking a couple of £1 million, it's probably going to be more than that, because we signed for, I think, about £4 million for Social. I think his parent club is, or Lorient, something like that, a League One side. But I think it depends on the transfer fee. But yeah, I would keep Jens.
Yeah, I mean, I was speaking on the bulletin on Thursday there, and my take on this is that you get Welsh out on loan for the rest of this season, and then you make a decision at the end of that. So you've got Welsh out on loan getting football, and then you decide, obviously with an option to buy at the end of that, wherever he might end up, and you decide at that point, at the end of the season, which one are we going to keep? Is it Jens or is it Stephen Welsh?
Yeah.
And then obviously, we're not going to get the same fee for Welsh. I wouldn't have thought that we then have to shell out for Jens, but it's not going to be a million miles away, and we keep the better of the two. If there's one player that we currently have out on loan that you think has a career at Celtic and has a future at Celtic, who would that player be? We've got 10 players out on loan at the moment, Paddy.
Yeah, well, I've got 2 written down here. Montgomery, I think he's still a young lad. He's still got a lot of development to do. He's a left back, showed a bit of promise when he was thrown into the first team last season. I think we should keep him. I think he should come back and be involved at some stage, even just around about the first team. He's not going to get in ahead of, let's face it, Greg Taylor or Burnaby, but in a couple of years' time, maybe he could be ready to kind of break into the first team. And I don't know why, right? I don't know why, but I've always liked to look at Urhoghide. He looks a big, strong, physical defender. When he first came in, when he played against Real Betis, he did all right. He had a decent game in that 3-2 win. And I thought at that stage, he just looked like a good defender to have around. There's just something about Urhoghide. I think if we let him go, we could be missing something. I think he's, 21, 22. So he's got a bit of development to go as well. All the rest, obviously, we don't need to talk about Barkas and Ayeti. We both know that none of them have got a future at Celtic. Sorrell's not got a future at Celtic. Neither Shaw. Johnny Kenny, 19-year-old, didn't he came in with a bit of promise. I just can't see that happening for him either. But Montgomery, I would say we keep. Mikey Johnson. Do you know what? If we didn't have Haksabanovic, would I take Mikey Johnson back? I don't know. That's a tough one. Would he break into that side? I mean, if I'm sitting telling you that Paddy Roberts couldn't break into the side, could Mikey Johnson? Probably not. And I liked Mikey as well. I love seeing a player come through youth ranks and make it at Celtic. We all do. I think Celtic fans as a whole love that. I'm talking myself out of Urhoghide now, but I think Montgomery would be one I would take back.
I'd agree with that. I would. As much as I would like to see Johnson, I think we've actually moved on. I think the standards have gone up. He's going to struggle to get into the side. And Urhoghide, as much as I agree with you against Betis, again, I just think he's a legacy signing that probably Ange didn't have much to do with. And if we do get a bid, I reckon, in fact, had we got a bid, I think he'd have been Offski, but they couldn't afford his fee at that time. So we'll
that's
see
the thing. I mean, I'm only basing Urhoghide on that performance.
Yeah.
And do you know that way when you look at someone, you think, I quite like the look of this player. There was just something that struck me on that day. I think we should have maybe tried with him, but Ange clearly knows what he's doing. He knows a player who might argue with the gaffer.
But we try to, don't we? We do try to on Acsom. I wouldn't do it to his face, I don't think, Paddy.
No,
that's for sure.
Not at all. No.
Listen, it's been an absolute pleasure over the last hour or so talking about those that got away. There are a few regrets there with the likes of Robbie Keane, Craig Bellamy, there are, and people might argue about Paddy Roberts. Let us know what you think in the comment section. We are here to raise cash for St Mary's, the birthplace of Celtic Football Club. All the links are underneath here, and if you want to download The Glory and the Dream, our charity single, the link is underneath this video. All that's left for me to say is, Paddy Sinnott, thank you so much for joining me on A Celtic State of Mind.
Thanks for having me.